today I'm sort of going to, my thought is to walk through my personal investment of how I came to research Cairo and why did I come to research it the way that I do. So I come from a disciplinary background of politics. We don't always engage with questions of dust or space in this particular way. And somehow I came to my research thinking, grappling with a common sense feeling um, that it was difficult to survive a city like Cairo. This is the city where, this is my city where I lived, where I worked, and which I was academically interested in for a long time. But then there was this common sense feeling that Cairo was a bit catastrophic or a bit too much, or a city that has somehow failed its earlier post-colonial promise. The image I have here about Cairo kills, for example, is a sort of a commonplace picture that people post at the end of the weekend, for example, looking forward to escaping the city that was so exhausting, full of traffic, full of noise. Some of the commonplace stereotypes about the city is that it is a concrete jungle. It's messy and not necessarily very pretty. This is a common sense feeling. I mean, there's nothing really particularly that grasps or that writes this formally in an archive or in academic literature, but it is something that you could sense, some sort of atmosphere that you could sense around walking around the city around the 2000s, before the revolution, and then also after, before the 2011 revolution, and also afterwards. So I came to ask certain questions. I came to research in Cairo, asking questions of how do we write histories of this mega city that seems to be in ruins. There's a lot of anxiety about the archives and the sources through which we can document the city, particularly because lots of buildings were being deconstructed, and there's a sense of losing control over the fate of the city as well. So my questions basically started with, like, if my city, the object of my research, is sort of being visually rendered as a place of rubble, of dust clouds, of lots of blocks of cement, and of noise and traffic. How do I interrogate these images in a way that doesn't really stereotype them, but also doesn't turn away from the fact of destruction? And in a sense, because I come from politics, I had this desire to question this relationship to politics in relationship to the city. If people think of the city as killing, if Cairo kills, then what does it tell us about the overall politics, about relationships of citizens to the state? So I have a set of questions that I would put around here, but basically it is primarily to think about how does a city come to disappoint us, and how does a post-colonial city that had a particular ambition for mastery, for sovereignty, that patterns certain attachments and certain desires, come to disappoint us, and how do we attend to that sense of disappointment, basically. The other question I was struggling with is basically like, how do we write as well from this particular moment? I started doing the research on Egypt after the Arab Spring, after 2013 actually, and in a sense that sort of the 2011 revolution. The Arab Spring basically creates a sense in which Egypt, Cairo specifically, becomes very researchable. There were lots of funds coming to do research on Egypt, and there was something that Mona Abaza calls like academic sightseeing, in which you act as a local informant to give people tours about Tahrir Square and also tell them about the question of the revolution. So the question is, with like, if you're in a post-colonial setting with an archive that seems to be fragmentary, when there is no this kind of mastery over how the city is evolving and how it is being taken shape of, and then suddenly a rupture comes in, like some place like the revolution that puts all of these into question, then how do you accommodate that? And how do you, as an academic writing in the UK about the place that is that's my hometown in Egypt, how do you not extract that? How do you not extract from elsewhere to talk to people here in the UK? So I mean, I was struggling with these sort of how do we write from the present about the past, and also how do we write from elsewhere about where we come from. So basically, I want to not spend a lot of time talking about theory, but just to talk about the people I'm thinking with. This whole idea came from lots of literature that comes from queer theory, really, that tells us that questions really the category of failure, not as something to be disavowed completely or reveled in, but also something that can be questioned in terms of teleology. What are the objects, like the everyday objects that construct or pattern attachments? And I've come to think about the city or the post-colony as that's one object of attachment. We, in a sense, we feel a sense of disappointment of the city because we are really attached to it, and we are really attached to a sense of a promise, particularly of a good life, or perhaps of conviviality or communality that sometimes it fulfills and sometimes it doesn't. I take that from people like Laurent Berlant, of course, but also Jack Halberstam, The Queer Art of Failure, and Writings About the City by Abdelmalik Simon. But also I was really interested in the whole idea of teleology, the fact that that this sense of disappointment comes in an aftermath of desired sovereignty. And this is someone like the anthropologist David Scott has been talking about and has been writing about a lot. What happens if we write our post-colonial histories or stories not in the form of a romance in which some heroic subject needs to overcome obstacles, but also within a temporality of the tragic, in which catastrophes happen, and which we really question the sense of agency and mastery over history, over past and present. Another two areas that were also at the time I was thinking with was sort of thinking about space as something that is disruptive, and elements of space as something that is disruptive. And this is a conversation particularly I felt was missing in literature, in IR, and in politics, that tends to look at space as the structural and the physical, rather as instead of as opposed to time that moves and that changes. And finally, which is why I've chosen this mode to speak about myself, is sort of to look into the possibilities of narrative as a counter to the big constructions and big ambitions of mastery over the city. So overall, what I'm trying to do is think about the city in its totality, although in its fragmentation, as an aftermath of promise. And this was personal because I was doing that kind of research. I was doing research on Cairo and its post-independence history, but I was writing after the so-called Arab Spring had temporarily failed. And this is where I came to dust. Part of me was trying to avoid writing about the Arab Spring, especially from the comforts and the security and the safety of doing research in the UK. And at the time, archives seemed to be a sort of a safe space. This is while acknowledging all the problems of post-colonial archives. People write about the archives as mastered, as a relationship of knowledge of power, as the way that its order is a reflection of relationships of power. And there's a lot that is hidden in the archive, obviously. But then another thing is that in terms of architecture, I was really interested in interrogating this ambition about a post-colonial city and looking into the architectural plans that either happened or never failed to materialize in Egypt in 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, where the 50s and 60s projected a kind of modern ambition to create for the post-colony, for thinking about the city anew. So I hit the archives in Egypt, and archives are really a funny place to be in Egypt. It's the archives are long held. It's a long held tradition of archival work. But then the archives of the architects, Egyptian architects and national architects, is actually not very well maintained. I was really lucky in hitting some sources of collections. Some of them weren't even still catalogized, like the collection was given, but it was still not sorted. But there was quite an acute awareness that collections are, or glean into the history of the city, you kind of need to be doing a Benjaminian way of collecting fragments and rags from the streets and trying to piece them together. And somehow there's no complete vision of the city, of its master planning or its ambition, which was fine, really. It was something that I was happy with to do with, to work with. Thing is, like with the knowledge that the archives are fragmented and you kind of get reconciled or reckon with the idea that you never have a complete history, and you start to dwell in it more. The question of dust came thus from the archive. I was looking into collections that were not sorted, were not yet cleaned, and the materiality of dust hit me as how it brushed over my clothes and over my hands and over the white gloves you need to wear when you're looking into archives and documents and things like that. But also because I was working within this overshadow of a revolution that is metaphorically always called as the Arab Spring. And I think since we're talking about dust, I think a lot of us know that the spring in Egypt is not really a nice season. This is when you get dust storms called the Khamaseen, and it is a season in which there's sentiments of an end of the sentiments that the world might be ending, where people have difficulties breathing, where you hide at home for days to escape the dust storm, and where dust really stores the temporality of the city. I mean, it seems to be ironic now talking about this since our conception of time and our rhythms of everyday working and seems to come to a complete stop. But this is something that is seasonal, that Egyptians are accustomed to, and most people in the Middle East as well would be accustomed to in the spring. And this was always ironic that the Arab Spring, the revolution, was sort of metaphorically tied into this occurrence of the Khamaseen, or of the seasonal dust storms. The picture I'm showing here is a statue called Khamaseen, and it's about a woman wading in the dust and sort of in the dust storm and trying to struggle against the dust. And somehow most of my research became a journey in which I was trying to figure out what is it exactly that I'm doing with dust? What is it, my relationship to dust? Why did I hide in the archives instead of looking into the Arab Spring? And what happens really with the materiality of the city that seems to be in ruin? And I find it really inspiring to take that from an architect's theory. Teresa Stupani has written a lot about architecture and dust. Similar to some of the conversations we've been having earlier, she looks into dust as a tool to explore what remains after a catastrophe, what remains after the orders that we've known have fragmented and there's no way to putting them back together again. With the explosion of established orders, dust become the fragments. The whole idea of the promise of dust, I find, is that as a metaphor and even as a materiality, it doesn't go away. It combines the material, the organic and the inorganic, and it is about disruption and destruction, of course. But it's also about that the idea that fragments never go away, and history, even though it's hidden, never really goes away. It lurks there, maybe in different forms, and it travels actually. So the whole idea that the fragment can create a new assemblage and the new assemblage can be the city was a sort of a methodology that inspired a sense of hope and a way into looking into a space that I felt was in an aftermath of something, after the revolution or of the post-independence as well. So without taking too much time, I'll just quickly walk through 3 vignettes from my research. So hopefully there would be time for questions and discussions afterwards. The first vignette is about fire. Now, I was interested in looking into fire because for everyone researching Cairo, the 1952 fire, which burned the downtown, is a really key temporal juncture. This is where this was in January 1952, and it was in protest to the British troops killing policemen in Egypt. And 6 months after, the day after that, people protested. The downtown, the city center of Cairo was burnt. And this has become a temporal marker in the history of Cairo. This is when the downtown burned. Lots of its modernist buildings were basically set ablaze. And 6 months afterwards, the officers' movement happened, which basically creates the de facto, the proper post-colonial, post-independence Egypt. Ends the monarchy, and like a new history of the state starts. So this is quite well researched, but then I was really thinking about the way that fire works and how it might orient to a less linear or less ordered narrative about the city than what we are accustomed to. So Gaston Bachelard writes that fire acts as a universal principle of investigation. No other element assembles areas that are usually seen as dichotomous, both evil and good, both desire and rage. Purging and impurity, destruction and promise. It even creates a regime of visibility, senses, rhythms, speed, life, death, and generation. So I think no element can really capture the enigma of doing research on the city better than the equal enigma of fire. When I was doing my research, I finished my field work in Cairo in mid-April 2016. I left with the sense that there were many untapped sources and documents of the history of the city. This sense of incompleteness is quite common in fieldwork research. It can, however, translate into anxiety in cases where the field, which is the city and its archival history, seems to be vulnerable, precarious, as if all its solidity could indeed melt into air. A fire marked the closure of my fieldwork and sealed in this sense of the precariousness and volatility of the materiality of the city, its space and their archival representations. During that time, a series of limited and now perhaps forgotten fires erupted in the city. Egyptian bloggers called it the season of fires in Cairo, recalling the 1952 Cairo fire and the Belle Epoque buildings that had previously existed in downtown Cairo. The last fire in this series targeted the buildings of the governorate in Cairo, the Abdin Square on Thursday, May the 12th in 2016. Of course, it generated conspiracy theories, suspicions of arson, fears and arguments that street vendors who are doing their activities there should be moved out of downtown. And it basically created moving targets of blame, which included both the agency of human responsibility and the non-human. The governorate's fire, however, caused a few injuries, but it evoked lots of fears about the loss of Cairo's documents, its tangible and material history lying dormant in government drawers and being set ablaze. The second vignette is about mud. Now, when I was doing research in archives, I think the most commonly known architect is Hassan Fathi, who was interested in, is well known and quite famous for his work on the architecture of the poor. Hassan Fathi looked into the idea of building with mud as a sort of a viable solution for rural building, and it was an experiment that was conducted in the 1940s in Egypt. And part of it was sort of thinking about a post-colonial ambition of creating a vernacular and maybe a national, an authentic architectural style. I was working within the archives, not looking at all at Hassan Fathi because I wasn't interested in his work at the time, but I was looking into another architect. But somehow his authority seemed to dominate the archive. His work was the one that was cleaned up, that was being shown for visitors for the archives. And even though I was working with other dusty and fragmented archives, his work seemed to hold the authority within it. I was always working under his shadow. And towards the end, I eventually had to address the position of Hassan Fathi within an architectural history of Egypt. Now, Hassan Fathi used mud as an architectural critique. For him, it was a way of creating a vernacular style, but also a way of criticizing what was modern, what was seen as modernist architecture in Egypt at the time. I was, however, interested with the fact that when Hassan Fathi chose to write about his experience and experiment, he chose to write about it in the 1970s. And this was a moment in Egypt in which there was a huge disappointment with the post-colonial promise, because this was after a massive defeat in 1967. Alongside with his work, thus I started reading the work of some of the geographers who basically articulated a sense of a regional identity of Egypt as a form of what I thought at the time, or what I've been thinking about as a form of repair to a disappointment of an attack of sovereignty. So, looking into the works of Hassan Fathi, not to recover it, his work is really well documented, but as a way in which some of the thinkers, architects, and geographers chose to look into the materiality of soil and mud and landscape of Egypt to articulate a sense of sovereignty and identity, and maybe authenticity, to articulate a sense of a modern national Egyptian subject at the time. My final vignette, so that we can have some time for final comments and questions, is about concrete. Now, concrete became, for some reason, became the material most preferred by modernist architects, and these are not well known. They're not well written about, although even though there are some really good writings coming about the modernist architectural heritage in Egypt. But these were the people who eventually built most of Egypt in post-independence. And it's ironic because it is what Cairenes love to hate. It's the type of building and urban form that we love to not like. So I'll read again from my vignettes here. In the mid-1970s, a monument of the unknown soldier was built in the then relatively new neighborhood of Madinat Nassr, which it's Arabic, but it can be translated as Nassr City or the City of Victory. The monument here is a hollow pyramid built of concrete, and the neighborhood is now a site of jokes. It is so overcrowded that it is hellish to get into, out of, or through. It is the typical experience of a noisy traffic jam. It is grid-like and gray. It is gray because its multi-story apartment blocks, all built of reinforced concrete, have draped themselves with dust and soot year after year. It is assaulted by neon boards advertising myriads of shopping stores and centers. They started cladding it in the 1990s and 2000s. They etched the neoliberalism of the 1990s into everyday walks and drives. In the middle, the monument appears merely as a backdrop to multiple traffic jams. The monument belongs to mid-1970s Cairo, a metaphor and a moment for the juncture when things went wrong. However, perhaps it has a value beyond existing as a temporary marker of collapse and kitsch in historicizing the city politics. Now, this street here is where I'd basically be stuck every day trying to access the archives. Eventually, I got the chance to interview the designer of the monument, and he gave me that picture in which there is a haunting presence of the monument that came to be afterwards. What was fascinating was that the monument wasn't meant to be there. And this is something that not a lot of people know, actually. Even though the actual designer of this whole vast neighborhood, the City of Victory, which was a marker and a project of post-independence Cairo, wanted to create a monument for an unknown soldier there, this remained opposed until the 1970s. And what came to be was a very concrete, people say now kitschy, but basically a hollow pyramid to memorialize the soldiers unknown soldiers from the 1973 war. The 1970s in Egypt is seen to be the time where Sadat took over from Nasser, when the direction of policies changed to open market, and basically the precursor of neoliberalism that would hit Egypt in the 1980s and 90s later on. Concrete, I think, slips between tradition and modernity, and Adrian Forty obviously has written about that. It is liquid and solid. It both works for highbrow architecture and ubiquitous and spontaneous buildings like slum building in Egypt. Cement binds sand, gravel, and water. It changes space and possibilities of building. And while its solidity might deceive us, its set and solid texture is a marker of temporality. Concrete was used to mediate life, death, and subjectivity, and I think it acted as a register of memory. So to end up, what basically I've been trying to do with Dust, Fire, and Concrete is to interrogate different ways in which the archives of Cairo are really fragmented and can glean from commonplace everyday object, but also in precisely the sites of catastrophe and disappointments that we need to work with. I've been trying and still grappling to work with a non-triumphalist narrative of urban spaces, which is really tricky if you're working within the context of the UK. Because it can easily slip into a self-orientalizing narrative about the city. I'm also thinking with materiality to think about a poetic of space that doesn't lock it in representation, which was really my problem when I started doing research in politics. That there was a sense that we can only write history through representation and through textuality, and without attention to either materiality or emotions. And somehow this question of how we can register and write histories of emotions and affect is still puzzling me, and I'm still working with it. But also I wanted to work with an aftermath of disappointment. I didn't want to wish this disappointment away to write about stories of heroic victory, even though they exist and they are important. But it was just my way to think about how people's relationship to the city might also be a question about their relationship to sovereign promises of postcoloniality. And the final question is basically the mode of narrative I chose, like writing myself in and writing my story of doing the research in is sort of me reconciling with the fact that a lot of academic urban literature is a way of has a fantasy of promising that we control our empirical objects of study. We research Cairo over there, and by then we get a sense of it and we can make it transparent and maybe understandable. And somehow just taking the cue from Julieta Singh's amazing work is to think about like how these promises of mastery also operate in our own subjectivities as we try to fix the city or write it up in a PhD thesis, for example.